June 17th, Saturday, 9:37 p.m. The lobby of the Polview Grand Hotel was buzzing with evening activity. Guests strolled in and out, bellhops scurried to and fro, and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. But in one corner, an argument was escalating, and everyone's attention quickly turned to the commotion. "Ma'am, sir, I've told you already, you don't belong here. I need you to leave before I call the police," barked the security guard, a burly man named Chuck with a habit of tossing his authority around. Standing in front of him were a sharply dressed couple, DeMarcus and Maya Johnson. They looked stunned, trying to keep their composure despite the blatant disrespect. "We're just trying to check in," DeMarcus said firmly, holding up his reservation confirmation. "You don't need to talk to us like this." Chuck crossed his arms, sneering. "Nice try. This isn't the kind of place for people like you. Now move along." The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, some shocked at the scene, while others awkwardly avoided eye contact. Maya's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "We're not going anywhere. We have every right to be here," Chuck scoffed, taking a step closer. "If you don't leave now, I'll have you dragged out of here." At that exact moment, the hotel manager hurried over, his face pale as he whispered something into Chuck's ear. The security guard's smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. He glanced nervously at DeMarcus and Maya, suddenly realizing the colossal mistake he'd just made. Security guard kicks black couple out of hotel, regrets it when he learns they own the place. The title of this story was playing out in real time, but what happened next? The entire room waited with bated breath as Chuck stood there frozen, caught between his own prejudice and the revelation that was about to change everything. Let's rewind. How do we get here? DeMarcus Johnson wasn't just anyone. He was a 35-year-old tech entrepreneur who had built his company, InnovateX, from the ground up. Maya, his equally impressive wife, was a high-profile lawyer known for taking on civil rights cases. Together, they were a power couple who had overcome every obstacle life threw at them. When DeMarcus decided to surprise Maya with a weekend getaway to celebrate their 10th anniversary, the Polview Grand seemed like the perfect spot. Nestled in downtown Atlanta, the luxury hotel was renowned for its rooftop pool and impeccable service. But what made the trip special was the secret DeMarcus had been keeping for months. He had quietly purchased the hotel as part of an investment deal. "I can't wait to see the look on her face when she finds out," DeMarcus had told his best friend, Jamal, a week before the trip. "This place will be her baby to run however she wants. It's hers now." Maya, of course, had no idea. All she knew was that her husband was taking her to an exclusive hotel for a romantic weekend. When they arrived that evening, she was already enchanted by the grand chandelier in the lobby and the sparkling marble floors. But the moment they stepped inside, Chuck had swooped in. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. DeMarcus smiled politely. "Yes, we have a reservation under Johnson." Chuck's face twisted, his eyes scanning them like they were criminals. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" "This is the Polview Grand." "Yes, I'm sure," DeMarcus replied, a slight edge creeping into his voice. Maya sensed the tension immediately. "What's the problem?" she asked. Chuck's response was curt. "No problem, but I'm going to need you two to step outside." "Excuse me?" Maya asked, stunned. "You heard me. Let's not make this a scene," Chuck said, his voice low but firm. At first, they thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the system had lost their reservation, or Chuck was just having a bad day. But as he continued to talk down to them, it became clear what was really going on. "This is outrageous," Maya said. "We're guests here." "Not anymore," Chuck said, folding his arms. "I'm giving you 5 minutes before I call for backup." The humiliation stung. Guests whispered among themselves, and DeMarcus could feel their eyes on him. He wanted to shout, to demand justice, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he pulled out his phone, ready to call the hotel manager. Before he could, the manager appeared, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit. He was visibly flustered as he hurried over. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Chuck and the Johnsons. "They don't belong here," Chuck said smugly, gesturing toward DeMarcus and Maya. The manager froze, his gaze darting to DeMarcus. Then his face went pale. "Wait, are you?" DeMarcus nodded, his voice calm but cold. Yes, I'm DeMarcus Johnson, and this is my wife, Maya. Chuck frowned, confused. So what? The manager leaned in close, his voice a panicked whisper. Chuck, they're the new owners. Chuck's jaw dropped. He looked at DeMarcus and Maya again, this time with a mix of shock and dread. Chuck's face was priceless, his jaw slack, his eyes darting around the lobby like he was searching for an escape route. The man who just moments ago had been so full of arrogance now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The silence in the lobby was deafening, broken only by the muffled buzz of someone's phone. Guests were still staring, some with their hands over their mouths, while others shuffled awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or leave. Maya crossed her arms, her lips pursed in that deadly calm way DeMarcus recognized as Herb lawyer mode. Chuck, is it? She said, tilting her head slightly. He nodded, barely able to meet her gaze. Let me get this straight, she continued. You just tried to throw us out of a hotel we own because, what? You didn't like the way we looked? Chuck stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know. I thought. You thought what? DeMarcus cut in, his voice as cool as steel. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the now terrified security guard. That we couldn't possibly belong here? That we couldn't afford it? Or that people like us shouldn't step foot in a place like this? Chuck opened his mouth, but no words came out. Answer him, Maya said sharply. I didn't mean any harm, Chuck mumbled, finally finding his voice. I thought I was doing my job. Your job? DeMarcus repeated, raising an eyebrow. Your job is to make sure guests feel safe and welcome, not to harass them because of your own prejudices. The hotel manager, whose name tag read Timothy Barnes, stepped in, his hands clasped nervously. Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, I am so sorry about this. Chuck's actions are absolutely unacceptable. I'll handle this immediately. Oh, you'll handle it? Maya said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Like you handle hiring him in the first place? Tell me, Timothy, does your staff receive any training on how to treat guests, or are they just winging it? Timothy's face flushed. That we do have training programs in place. But clearly, more work needs to be done. Clearly, DeMarcus said, his voice low but firm. Because this isn't just about Chuck. This is about the culture you've allowed to fester in this hotel. And since we're the new owners, let me assure you, things are about to change. The crowd in the lobby erupted into murmurs. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. DeMarcus noticed but didn't mind. If this moment went viral, it would only serve to highlight the kind of systemic issues they were determined to address. Maya stepped closer to Chuck, her eyes locking onto his. You made us feel small, unwelcome, and unsafe in a place that belongs to us. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Chuck hung his head. I'm sorry, he muttered. That's not enough, Maya said, her voice unwavering. An apology doesn't erase what you did, or how many others you probably treated this way before us. Timothy cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Chuck, I think it's best if you step outside for now while we sort this out. Chuck nodded silently, his shoulders slumped as he shuffled toward the exit. But DeMarcus wasn't done. Hold on, he said, stopping Chuck in his tracks. You owe us an explanation. I want to hear, in your own words, why you thought we didn't belong here. Go ahead. Tell everyone. Chuck froze, glancing around at the crowd. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I don't know, he stammered. I thought you might be trouble. Trouble? Maya repeated, her voice incredulous. What exactly about us seemed troublesome to you? Was it the way we were dressed? The color of our skin? Or was it something else? I don't know. Chuck blurted, his voice cracking. I just thought. You didn't think, DeMarcus interrupted. That's the problem. You acted on bias, plain and simple. The tension in the room was thick. Even the guests who had tried to pretend they weren't watching were now glued to the drama unfolding before them. Timothy stepped forward again, wringing his hands. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I assure you, Chuck will face the appropriate consequences for his actions. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and we take it very seriously. Oh, we're not done yet, Maya said, her eyes narrowing. DeMarcus and I will personally review every policy, every training manual, and every hiring decision made in this hotel. If there's a pattern of discrimination here, and I'm willing to bet there is, we're going to root it out." DeMarcus nodded. "Effective immediately, this hotel is under new management. And I promise you, by the time we're done, it will be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of how they look or where they come from." The crowd began to clap, some cheering, others nodding in agreement. But just as things seemed to calm down, a voice piped up from the back of the room. "Excuse me." Everyone turned to see an older white woman standing near the elevator. She looked flustered, clutching a designer handbag. "I'm sorry, but are you saying they own this hotel now?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. Maya's eyes narrowed. DeMarcus could feel his blood boiling again. "Is there a problem with that?" Maya asked, her voice sharp. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "Well, I just think it's unusual, that's all." "Unusual?" DeMarcus repeated, stepping forward. "Why don't you explain what you mean by that?" The woman opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. She looked around nervously as the crowd turned their attention to her. The room was silent again, but this time, the tension was almost unbearable. All eyes were on the older woman near the elevator, her cheeks turning a bright shade of red as she fidgeted under the weight of everyone's stares. She had clearly expected her comment to go unnoticed or unchallenged, but that wasn't going to happen. DeMarcus adjusted his posture, standing tall and calm. "You said you find it unusual that my wife and I own this hotel. Why is that?" The woman's lips parted, but she hesitated, clearly weighing her words. I've been staying at this hotel for years, and I've never seen owners like you before." "Owners like us?" Maya repeated, her tone razor-sharp. "I don't mean any offense," the woman stammered. "It's just, well, this hotel has always been run a certain way, and I guess I'm just surprised by the change." DeMarcus took a step closer, his voice firm but not raised. "Surprised by the change or uncomfortable with it?" The woman opened her mouth again, but Maya held up her hand, stopping her. "Actually, let me save you the trouble of answering," Maya said, her voice steady. "Because your comment wasn't just unusual. It was offensive. What you're really saying is that you don't think people like us are capable of owning a place like this. And that kind of thinking is exactly why change is needed." The crowd began murmuring, and the woman's face grew even redder. "That's not what I meant," she said weakly. "Then what did you mean?" DeMarcus asked pointedly. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds an awful lot like you're saying the quiet part out loud." The woman fumbled with her handbag, clearly looking for a way out of the conversation. "I'm sorry if it came out wrong," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." "Intent doesn't erase impact," Maya said, her voice unwavering. "Your words reveal a mindset that has been allowed to go unchecked for too long. And let me make one thing very clear. This isn't just our hotel now. It's a space where everyone, regardless of their background, can feel welcomed and valued. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's something you need to reflect on." The woman looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. She mumbled another apology before quickly turning toward the elevator, hitting the button repeatedly as though her life depended on it. DeMarcus turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces staring back at him. "For anyone else wondering, yes, my wife and I own this hotel now. And yes, that might come as a shock to some of you. But let me assure you of this. Poolview Grand is no longer just a place of luxury. It's going to be a place of integrity. A place where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve." The crowd erupted into applause. Some guests even cheered, while others nodded in agreement. Maya glanced at DeMarcus, giving him a subtle nod of approval. But as the applause died down, Timothy, the hotel manager, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he began, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in private. There are a few things we need to address regarding the staff and policies moving forward." Maya smirked. "Oh, don't worry, Timothy. We're going to have plenty of conversations about that. Starting right now." As they walked toward the manager's office, Chuck was sitting on a bench near the front desk, his head in his hands. DeMarcus paused, glancing at the disgraced security guard. "Chuck, a word," he said. Chuck looked up, his face a mixture of embarrassment and dread. "Yes, sir." DeMarcus gestured for Chuck to follow them. "Let's talk." Inside the office, Timothy sat at his desk, fidgeting nervously while Maya stood by the window, her arms crossed. Chuck stood by the door, looking like a student about to be sent to detention. "Chuck," DeMarcus began, leaning against the edge of the desk, "I want to know how long you've worked here." "About 6 years," Chuck said quietly. "And in those 6 years, how many guests have you treated the way you treated us tonight?" Chuck's eyes widened. "None, sir. I swear this was a misunderstanding. I've never—" "Stop," Maya interrupted. "We're not interested in excuses. What we need to understand is whether this was a one-off incident or part of a pattern. And, judging by how quickly you made assumptions about us, I'm guessing it's not the first time you've acted this way." Chuck looked down at his shoes, silent. DeMarcus exchanged a glance with Maya before speaking again. "Here's the deal, Chuck. We believe in second chances, when they're earned. You've been working here long enough to know better, but tonight, you let your biases take over. That's unacceptable." "I understand," Chuck said quietly. "Do you?" Maya asked, stepping forward. "Because if you stay on staff, you're going to have to do the work to unlearn those biases. That means mandatory training, regular evaluations, and being held accountable for your actions. Do you think you can handle that?" Chuck looked up, his expression a mixture of shame and determination. "Yes, ma'am. I can handle it. I want to make this right." DeMarcus nodded. "Good. Because we're not just here to run a hotel. We're here to change the culture. And you're either part of that change, or you're out the door." Chuck swallowed hard but nodded. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Maya raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." Just as the tension in the room began to ease, Timothy's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, his face paling as he read the message. "What is it?" DeMarcus asked. Timothy hesitated. "It's a group of reporters. They're outside. Someone must have recorded the incident in the lobby and leaked it. They want a statement." Maya and DeMarcus exchanged a look. "Looks like the world's watching," Maya said with a smirk. DeMarcus straightened his tie. "Then let's give them something worth watching." The soft glow of the hotel lobby lights spilled onto the sidewalk outside, where a growing crowd of reporters had gathered. Cameras flashed, microphones were being adjusted, and the hum of whispered speculation buzzed in the air. The incident in the lobby had spread like wildfire, and the media was hungry for a statement. DeMarcus and Maya stood by the glass doors, flanked by Timothy and Chuck, who looked like he'd rather sink into the floor than face the cameras. DeMarcus turned to his wife. "You ready?" he asked. Maya smirked. "Always." Timothy opened the doors, and the noise from the reporters hit them like a wave. Questions flew in rapid succession. "Mr. Johnson, what happened in the lobby tonight?" "Mrs. Johnson, do you believe this was racially motivated? Is it true you're the new owners of the Polview Grand? What changes will you be making to the hotel?" DeMarcus raised his hands, and the reporters quieted down. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Good evening. My name is DeMarcus Johnson, and this is my wife, Maya. We are, in fact, the new owners of the Polview Grand Hotel." The reporters erupted into murmurs, jotting notes and whispering into microphones. "I know many of you are here because of what happened tonight," DeMarcus continued. "Let me be clear. What my wife and I experienced in this very lobby was unacceptable. But it's not just about us. What happened tonight is a symptom of a larger problem, a culture of bias and discrimination that we, as the new owners, are committed to addressing head-on." The crowd went silent, hanging on to every word. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady and firm. "We didn't plan to make our ownership public tonight," she said. "But perhaps it's fitting, because this hotel isn't just a business to us. It's an opportunity to set a new standard. No guest, regardless of their race, gender, or background, should ever feel unwelcome in a space like this." A reporter raised her hand. "Mrs. Johnson, do you believe the incident tonight was racially motivated?" Maya didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said plainly. "And while we're grateful that the hotel manager stepped in before things escalated further, the fact that it happened at all is proof that change is needed." Another reporter jumped in. "What changes are you planning to make?" DeMarcus smiled. "That's a great question. Effective immediately, we're implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. We're reviewing our hiring practices to ensure diversity and inclusion are at the forefront. And we're establishing a guest feedback program so that issues like this can be reported and addressed in real time. The reporters scribbled furiously, the glow of camera lights illuminating the determined expressions on DeMarcus and Maya's faces. And let me add this, Maya said, her voice rising slightly. We're not just here to fix what's broken. We're here to create something better, a place where everyone feels valued and respected. That's what the Polview Grand will stand for from now on. The crowd erupted into applause. Some of the reporters even put their pens down to clap, a rare show of emotion from the usually stoic press. As the reporters began packing up, a young black journalist approached DeMarcus and Maya. She introduced herself as Alyssa Green from a local news station. I just wanted to say thank you, Alyssa said, her voice soft but sincere. What you're doing, it matters. It's inspiring to see people like you in leadership positions, taking a stand. DeMarcus smiled. Thank you, Alyssa. That means a lot. Do you mind if I ask one more question? She said, lowering her voice so the other reporters wouldn't hear. Of course, Maya replied. Alyssa hesitated for a moment before asking, do you think this incident will have a ripple effect? Do you think it'll inspire other businesses to confront these kinds of issues? Maya thought for a moment before responding. I hope so, she said. Because this isn't just about one hotel, one incident, or even one industry. It's about changing the way we treat each other on every level. And if our actions here inspire even one other business to follow suit, then we'll consider that a victory. Alyssa nodded, smiling. Thank you for your time. I'll be following this story closely. Inside the hotel, Timothy was waiting nervously by the front desk. As DeMarcus and Maya walked back in, he straightened his tie and cleared his throat. I just wanted to say you handled it incredibly well, Timothy said. The way you spoke out there, it was powerful. Thank you, DeMarcus said. But words are just the beginning. Now comes the hard part, making sure this place lives up to the vision we just laid out. Timothy nodded quickly. Absolutely. I'll do everything I can to support you. Good, Maya said. Because we're going to hold you accountable, Timothy. This isn't a one-person job. It's a team effort. And if anyone on this team isn't ready to step up, they'll need to step aside. Timothy gulped but nodded. Understood. Just as they were about to head upstairs to finally enjoy some privacy, Chuck approached them. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked like he hadn't taken a full breath since the press conference. I just wanted to say, he began, his voice shaky. I'm really sorry for everything, and I meant what I said earlier. I want to make this right. DeMarcus studied him for a moment before nodding. We'll see, Chuck. Actions speak louder than words. Thank you, Chuck said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Chuck walked away, Maya turned to DeMarcus. Think he'll stick it out? I don't know, DeMarcus said honestly. But if he's willing to do the work, I'm willing to give him a chance. Maya smiled. You're a better person than I am. DeMarcus chuckled. That's why we make a good team. The morning after the chaotic evening felt like a new beginning for the Polview Grand. Or at least, that's what DeMarcus and Maya hoped. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the hotel lobby, casting a golden glow on the marble floors. The Johnsons were seated in the boardroom on the 12th floor, ready to meet with the department heads and senior staff. But the atmosphere in the room was far from warm. DeMarcus scanned the faces of the dozen or so staff members seated around the long table. Most looked nervous, their hands fidgeting or their gazes fixed on the table. But a few looked outright hostile, their expressions stony, their arms crossed as though bracing for battle. Maya, ever perceptive, leaned over to DeMarcus and whispered, We've got some resistance in the room. DeMarcus gave a slight nod. Let's see how they play their cards. Timothy, seated near the end of the table, cleared his throat and gestured for everyone's attention. All right, everyone, let's get started. As you all know, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson are the new owners of the Polview Grand, and they'll be sharing their vision for the hotel moving forward. Maya stood first, her posture confident and commanding. Good morning, everyone. As Timothy said, we're here to talk about the future of this hotel. But before we get into specifics, let me say this. We're not here to tear anyone down. We're here to build something better. And that starts with all of you. She paused, letting her words sink in. Some staff members nodded, their shoulders relaxing slightly. Others remained stiff, their skepticism etched into their faces. DeMarcus stood next, his deep voice filling the room. Last night's incident was a wake-up call for all of us. What happened in that lobby was unacceptable, and it's our responsibility to ensure it never happens again. That's why we're implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, along with mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. At this, a man seated at the far end of the table scoffed audibly. He was older, with silver hair and a name tag that read Edward Gaines, Director of Operations. "Something you'd like to share, Edward?" Maya asked, her tone sharp. Edward leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I just don't see why we're making such a big deal out of one incident. Chuck overreacted, it happens. Does that mean we have to overhaul the entire hotel?" The tension in the room shot up like a thermometer in the desert. DeMarcus kept his cool. "Edward, let me ask you something. How many guests like us have been turned away, disrespected, or made to feel unwelcome over the years? How many people never even filed a complaint because they assumed nothing would change?" Edward shrugged. "I don't know. But this is a business, not a social experiment. Guests care about luxury, not politics." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Let me stop you right there. Treating people with respect isn't politics, it's human decency. And if you think we can run a successful business without it, you're in the wrong room." A few staff members nodded in agreement, but Edward wasn't backing down. "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've seen owners come and go, and I know what works. You can't run a hotel by bending over backward for every little complaint. It's not sustainable." DeMarcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "We're not asking you to bend over backward, Edward. We're asking you to do your job with integrity. If that's too much for you, then maybe it's time to rethink your role here." The room went silent. Edward's face turned red, but he didn't respond. Maya stepped forward, her voice firm but measured. "We're not here to argue. We're here to lead. And let me make one thing very clear. This hotel is under new management. If you can't get on board with our vision, we won't hesitate to make changes." After the meeting, DeMarcus and Maya retreated to their office, exhausted but resolute. "Well, that went about as well as expected," Maya said, sinking into a chair. "Edward's going to be a problem," DeMarcus said, pacing the room. "Let him," Maya replied. "He's already digging his own grave. The more he resists, the easier it'll be to justify replacing him." Before DeMarcus could respond, Timothy knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Got a minute?" Timothy asked. "Of course," DeMarcus said. Timothy closed the door behind him, his expression grim. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. Edward's been with the hotel since it opened. He's got connections, board members, investors, you name it. If he feels threatened, he might start stirring up trouble." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "Neither," Timothy said quickly. "Just something to keep in mind. The staff is already on edge after last night, and if Edward starts rallying them against you, it could get messy." DeMarcus nodded thoughtfully. "Thanks for the heads up, Timothy. But we're not backing down. If Edward wants to play games, we'll deal with him." That afternoon, DeMarcus and Maya decided to walk through the hotel to get a sense of how the staff and guests were feeling. Most employees greeted them with polite smiles, though some avoided eye contact entirely. In the housekeeping department, a young woman named Sophia hesitated before approaching them. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson?" she said softly. "Yes," Maya replied, her tone warm. Sophia glanced around nervously before leaning in. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said in the meeting. A lot of us, we've dealt with things here that we didn't feel safe talking about. But now it feels like maybe things will change." Maya placed a reassuring hand on Sophia's shoulder. "They will, Sophia. I promise you that." DeMarcus nodded. "If you ever feel like something isn't right, you come straight to us. Our door is always open." Sophia smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you. That means a lot." But just as things seemed to be looking up, a staff member rushed toward them, looking frantic. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, you need to come to the lobby," he said, out of breath. "What's going on?" DeMarcus asked. "There's a group of guests causing a scene," the staff member said. "They're demanding to speak with the owners, and it's not pretty." DeMarcus and Maya exchanged a glance. "Let's go," Maya said. DeMarcus and Maya descended to the lobby, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise hushed elevator. When the doors opened, the sight that greeted them was chaotic. A group of about 5 guests stood near the reception desk, raising their voices while a visibly flustered Timothy tried to calm them down. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered nearby, whispering among themselves. Finally, one of the guests, a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit, said as he spotted DeMarcus and Maya, "Are you the owners? Because this is outrageous." DeMarcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "Yes, I'm DeMarcus Johnson, and this is my wife, Maya. What seems to be the issue?" The man crossed his arms. "The issue? The issue is that we've been loyal patrons of this hotel for years, and now you're running it into the ground with all these changes." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Changes? You'll have to be more specific." Another guest, a woman with a designer handbag and an air of entitlement, chimed in. "Don't play dumb. We've heard all about the new policies you're planning to implement. Mandatory staff training, feedback programs, a so-called inclusive environment. This is a luxury hotel, not some social justice experiment." DeMarcus exchanged a glance with Maya, keeping his composure. "So, let me get this straight. You're upset because we're taking steps to ensure that this hotel treats all its guests and staff with respect?" The man in the suit scoffed. "Oh, don't twist it around. This hotel has always been about exclusivity. People come here to get away from the world, not to deal with politics." "Politics?" Maya repeated, her tone sharp. "Respect and fairness aren't politics. They're basic human decency." "You say that now," the woman shot back. "But what's next? Lowering the standards to cater to people who can't afford to be here? Changing the dress code? Letting anyone walking off the street?" Maya's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "Let me be very clear. Nothing about the quality of service at this hotel is going to change. If anything, it's going to improve. But if you're uncomfortable with the idea of a space where everyone feels welcome, then maybe this isn't the place for you." The man in the suit took a step forward, his voice rising. "Oh, so now you're telling me to leave? This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is not how you run a business." DeMarcus stepped in, his tone calm but firm. "We're not telling anyone to leave, but we won't apologize for creating a space where everyone is treated fairly. If that doesn't align with your values, that's your choice." The tension in the room was palpable. The onlookers watched in silence, some nodding in agreement with the Johnsons, others shifting uncomfortably. At that moment, an elderly black woman in a modest dress stepped forward from the crowd. She looked hesitant but determined. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. All eyes turned to her. "I've been coming to this hotel for years too," she continued. "And let me tell you, there have been plenty of times I felt unwelcome, like I didn't belong. But I kept coming back because I love the place. And now, knowing that the owners are people who care about folks like me, it makes me proud to stay here." The room fell silent. The entitled guests exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, while others in the crowd began to nod and murmur in agreement. DeMarcus smiled warmly at the woman. "Thank you for sharing that. It means a lot." She gave a small nod, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You two keep doing what you're doing. Don't let anyone stop you." One of the entitled guests, the woman with the handbag, huffed and grabbed her things. "Well, this is ridiculous. I'm checking out." The man in the suit looked flustered, as if deciding whether to follow her. Finally, he muttered, "This place isn't what it used to be," before storming out after her. Maya watched them leave, then turned to the remaining guests in the room. "For those of you still here, let me reiterate, the Polview Grand will always be a place of luxury, but it will also be a place of integrity. We're not compromising on that." The crowd began to disperse, with some guests offering polite nods or murmured thanks as they walked away. Timothy, still looking frazzled, approached DeMarcus and Maya. I didn't know how to handle that," he admitted. "You handled it better than I ever could." That's why we're here, Timothy, DeMarcus said. And situations like this are why the changes we're making are so important. Later that evening, as DeMarcus and Maya sat in their suite, the weight of the day finally began to settle on them. That was intense, Maya said, pouring herself a glass of wine. Yeah, DeMarcus agreed, leaning back on the couch. But I think we're starting to turn the tide. Slowly, but surely. Maya nodded. Still, we've got a long way to go. People like Edward, guests like those in the lobby, they're not going to go quietly. DeMarcus smirked. Let them fight. The more noise they make, the more obvious it'll be that they're the ones in the wrong. Maya raised her glass. To progress, no matter how messy it gets. DeMarcus clinked his glass against hers. To progress. But just as they began to relax, Maya's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the message. What is it? DeMarcus asked. Maya looked up, her face serious. It's from Timothy. He says Edwards called a meeting with some of the senior staff, behind our backs. DeMarcus sat up straight. So it begins. Maya set her glass down, her eyes blazing with determination. Let's see what Edward's up to. The Polview Grants conference room on the third floor was dimly lit, with just enough light to illuminate the faces of the 8 people seated around the long table. At the head of the table sat Edward Gaines, his expression as smug as ever. This hotel is going down the drain, Edward began, leaning forward with his hands clasped. And if we don't do something about it, we'll all be out of jobs by the end of the year. The staff members around him exchanged uneasy glances. Most of them had worked at the hotel for years and had grown comfortable with Edward's leadership. But even they could sense this meeting was walking a fine line. What exactly are you proposing? Asked Linda, the head of housekeeping, her voice wary. Edward smirked. I'm proposing we push back. The Johnsons are running this place like it's some kind of social experiment. If we let them continue, they'll alienate the loyal clientele that made this hotel what it is. But they own the hotel, said another staff member, a young assistant manager named Rachel. What can we even do? Edward waved his hand dismissively. Ownership only gets you so far. The success of this place depends on us. We're the ones who keep the wheels turning. If we refuse to support their so-called changes, they'll have no choice but to back down or sell the place to someone who knows what they're doing. There was a murmur of agreement from a few staff members, but others looked uncomfortable. Isn't that a bit extreme? Rachel asked. I mean, sure, some of their ideas are different, but is it really worth risking our jobs over? Edward fixed her with a hard stare. Do you really want to work in a place where you're constantly walking on eggshells? Where every decision is scrutinized for bias or inclusion? Trust me, Rachel, this isn't just about them. It's about us. About protecting what we've built. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door burst open. Standing in the doorway were DeMarcus and Maya, their expressions unreadable. Don't let us interrupt, Maya said, stepping into the room. Please, Edward, continue. This little strategy session sounds fascinating. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Edward's smug expression faltered, but he quickly recovered. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, he said, forcing a smile. What a surprise. Oh, it's no surprise to us, DeMarcus said, his tone calm but cutting. We heard you were holding a meeting, so we thought we'd join. After all, this is our hotel. The staff members around the table looked like they wanted to disappear. Some stared at their hands. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Maya took a seat at the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. So, Edward, tell us, what exactly is this meeting about? Edward leaned back in his chair, trying to appear nonchalant. It's nothing serious. Just a discussion about how we can navigate some of the changes you proposed. Really? Maya said, raising an eyebrow. Because it sounded more like you were rallying the staff against us. DeMarcus crossed his arms. Here's the thing, Edward. We're not fools. We know resistance when we see it. So why don't you cut the act and tell us what you're really trying to accomplish? Edward's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, with a sigh, he leaned forward, his mask of politeness slipping away. Fine, he said. You want the truth? Here it is. I don't think you have what it takes to run this hotel. You're turning it into a political statement, and that's not what the Polview Grand is about. You're alienating the guests who've been coming here for years, the ones who pay the bills. And frankly, I don't see this place surviving under your leadership." The room went silent. Even the staff members who had been nodding along with Edward earlier now looked nervous. DeMarcus let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "You're entitled to your opinion, Edward. But let me remind you of something. We own this hotel. And while we value input from our staff, insubordination and sabotage will not be tolerated." Maya leaned in, her eyes locked on Edward. "And let me be clear about something else. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. If you're not willing to be part of the solution, then you're part of the problem." Edward scoffed. "That's rich coming from someone who's been here for all of 5 minutes. I've dedicated my life to this place. I know what works and what doesn't. And yet, here we are," DeMarcus said, his voice calm but firm. "An incident occurred on your watch. An incident that never should have happened. So, maybe it's time to question whether your way of doing things is really working." The staff members shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. Maya stood, smoothing out her jacket. "This meeting is over. If any of you have concerns about the changes we're making, you're welcome to bring them to us directly. Our door is always open. But if we find out anyone is working against us, there will be consequences." DeMarcus nodded. "We're not here to make enemies. But we're not here to play games, either. The Polview Grand is moving forward, with or without you." Without waiting for a response, they turned and walked out of the room, leaving the staff in stunned silence. Back in their office, Maya slumped into a chair, rubbing her temples. "That man is exhausting." DeMarcus chuckled. "He's definitely persistent. But at least now we know where we stand. Do you think he'll back off?" Maya asked. "Not a chance," DeMarcus said. "He's too proud to admit defeat. But that's okay. We'll be ready for him." The tension at the Polview Grand was palpable in the days following Edward's failed secret meeting. DeMarcus and Maya noticed subtle shifts in the staff's behavior. Some employees seemed reinvigorated, their smiles more genuine, their interactions more professional. Others, however, grew colder, more distant. Edward's influence, it seemed, was still casting a shadow over the hotel. But what neither DeMarcus nor Maya expected was Edward's final play. It was Friday morning when Timothy burst into their office, his face pale and his voice trembling. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, we have a serious problem." Maya set down her coffee, her brow furrowing. "What's going on, Timothy?" Timothy handed them a printed document, a copy of an email Edward had sent to several high-profile clients of the hotel. The subject line read, "An urgent warning about the Polview Grand's new management." DeMarcus scanned the email quickly, his jaw tightening with every word. Edward had painted a damning picture of the Johnsons, accusing them of prioritizing political agendas over the hotel's legacy of luxury. The email warned loyal clients that their beloved retreat was on the verge of being radically transformed, urging them to take their business elsewhere before it's too late. Maya's face hardened. "He's trying to sabotage us?" Timothy nodded nervously. "And it's working. We've already had 3 cancellations this morning from long-term clients. If this keeps up..." DeMarcus stood, his voice calm but edged with steel. "It won't keep up. We're putting a stop to this right now." The confrontation. They found Edward in his office, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk. He didn't even flinch when DeMarcus and Maya walked in, their expressions thunderous. "Well, if it isn't the dynamic duo," Edward said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What can I do for you?" Maya didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slammed the printed email onto his desk. "Care to explain this?" Edward glanced at the paper, then shrugged. "I thought it was important to warn our clients about the direction this hotel is headed. They have a right to know what they're paying for." DeMarcus leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "What they're paying for is a luxury experience, not your toxic, self-serving agenda. You're actively trying to destroy this hotel. And for what? Your ego." Edward stood, his smug demeanor faltering slightly. "I'm trying to save this hotel from you. You're turning it into something it was never meant to be." "What this hotel was never meant to be," Maya shot back, "was a place where bias and exclusion are tolerated. The fact that you can't see that says everything about why you don't belong here. Edward's face reddened. You don't get to decide whether I belong here. I've been loyal to this place for 30 years, and I've done more for it than you ever will. DeMarcus folded his arms, his voice calm but unyielding. Loyalty doesn't excuse bad behavior, Edward. You may have been here for 30 years, but that doesn't give you the right to undermine us, or the vision we have for this hotel. Maya took a step closer, her eyes locked on Edward's. You crossed the line, and you know it. Sending that email wasn't just insubordination, it was sabotage. And it ends here? Edward's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. What are you going to do? Fire me? Go ahead. But good luck running this place without me. Maya smiled, a cold, calculated smile. Firing you is the least of what we're going to do. The fallout. By the end of the day, Edward's termination was official. Maya and DeMarcus issued a public statement, not only announcing his removal, but also addressing the email he had sent. They emphasized their commitment to creating a welcoming environment for all guests and reassured clients that the hotel's standards of luxury would remain uncompromised. To their surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Social media lit up with praise for the Johnsons' leadership, with many commenters applauding their transparency and integrity. A few of the clients Edward had targeted even reached out directly, expressing their support and confirming their future bookings. But the biggest surprise came from within the hotel itself. A staff united. 2 days after Edward's departure, DeMarcus and Maya walked into the employee break room to find a handwritten note pinned to the bulletin board. It was signed by dozens of staff members and read, "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, thank you for standing up for what's right. We believe in your vision for the Polview Grand, and we're ready to move forward together." Maya blinked back tears as she read the note. DeMarcus placed a hand on her shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "They're with us," Maya said softly. DeMarcus nodded. "And that means we're going to win a new chapter." With Edward gone and the staff rallying behind them, the Johnsons wasted no time implementing their vision. The anti-bias training sessions began immediately, and new policies were rolled out to ensure transparency and accountability at every level of the organization. The changes didn't happen overnight, and there were still bumps along the way. But slowly, the Polview Grand began to transform, not just into a luxury hotel, but into a symbol of progress and inclusion. One afternoon, as DeMarcus and Maya walked through the lobby, they noticed Sophia, the young housekeeper who had approached them earlier, chatting with a guest. Her smile was genuine, her confidence radiant. "That," Maya said, gesturing towards Sophia, "is what this is all about." DeMarcus nodded. "It's not just about a hotel. It's about creating a legacy." Maya smiled, taking his hand. "And we're just getting started."